Alright, g'day guys. This is basically just a quick tips and tricks on how to install and things to go over and be aware of if you're purchasing a Taranis and are looking to assemble it yourself. Basically, there's a few things that are a little bit different. So as you can see, it's a completely different gearbox design where the piston and the cylinder have been inverted. So basically the cylinder used to sit still, but now this is more your piston, this is more your cylinder, looking like a piston slash cylinder. You do have a voluming difference on the Taranis, so you do have to be aware that if you are trying to chase higher FPS 320s or so, to bear in mind that the volume equivalent in this is about a 70%, so max barrel length is about 30 centimeters. Other little things to be aware of are that there are little bearings that basically sit inside the gearbox. There are 4, so before you put them into the gearbox you do have to basically grease them up. Use a nice sort of grease, PTFE grease, so any sort of excess doesn't damage any seals or anything like that. Basically, to be aware that these are a bearing, so you do have to have them greased up. They are rubbing metal on metal, so if you grease them up, pack them in full of grease, lots of grease, and then install them. The shape of the piston head is a little bit different. It does go in one way, so it is a one-way sort of setup, and it does also have an Apache built in. So all of these are pre-assembled, so everything in the back here is done with red Loctite. When you do install your gears, make sure with your sector you pull the screws out, red Loctite the screws back in nice and tight, and everything, I'm talking everything, needs to be Loctited in with blue Loctite. So when you're installing your screws into your gearbox, blue Loctite, and lots of blue Loctite, not just a little drop. Make sure you use plenty of blue Loctite and crank all the screws down as tight as you can possibly get it. The vibration on the recoil on these things is absolutely insane. So when you're firing, everything is vibrating and shaking and basically moving around, and you want to keep everything in place as much as possible. The spring retainer in the back, if you are installing this into say like a Venom with that open style receiver where the buffer tube doesn't screw into the back of the spring retainer, once you get your spring retainer in, you will be supplied with one of these. Basically put it on the back and screw all the way down and in to stop that spring retainer coming out. That spring retainer we found is prone to coming out just because of how heavy the bolt is and how much vibration is going on. So you do have to be aware of that just to make sure it doesn't actually pop out. Another thing to be aware of is that on this specific set of racks, you do have to short stroke 2 teeth off your sector. So with your sector, basically as it comes around and picks up your gear, you can see that there is two extra teeth. Those last 2 teeth need to come off, but when you short stroke them off the pickup side. So you're basically eliminating them off the pickup side. With an Apache, it doesn't really matter which way you short stroke, just because it won't affect your timing. It is self-timing. But in order to preserve your gear for future, say in future you put it in a different build and it's on a tappet, etc., you don't want those last 2 teeth short stroked off. You want the first 2 teeth short stroked. So the piston rack itself is already short stroked. That is a hardened CNC rack. These things are by far the hardest racks I've ever seen, and they are retained by the whole back part here on your cylinder, which is used to be a piston but is now your cylinder. These are the springs that will be provided just because of how the setup is, and the way that it functions. You can't use full length springs, So they are custom springs that are made to suit the Taranis. Moving forward, basically you will have, this is your little collar for your barrel. So what this does is basically your Apache tip is already pre-installed. So as it's pre-installed, you can see everything is sort of locked in place there. You do have your collar sleeve. Basically that sits into your inbuilt T-piece. So you don't have to worry about, you know, spacing your rubber for feeding, things like that. These are the perfect dimensions. You won't get any double feeds. And it does seal hard up against the bucking slash sleeve. We have noticed that you do on the end of the barrel have to rough up the end of the barrel ever so slightly, just scuff it up. And same with the inside of this. So just take a little file, just scuff up the inside and use an epoxy. So basically an epoxy that will retain some you know, it's not too brittle. So your typical JB weld is far too hard, and with the vibration it can cause that bond to break. You do want something that is a little bit flexible. So we have been using this JB weld. So this here will basically keep your barrel from coming out. So because it's two metal on metal surfaces, super glue, JB weld, anything with a brittle type nature, it will break the bond and your barrel will slip out the front. Therefore you will get double feeds, loss of FPS, etc. So just make sure when you're installing your barrel that is the case. Spring retainer will already come pre-assembled. So you will already have a spring retainer that is assembled and red Loctited together, so you won't have to worry about doing that. But like I said, everything else basically has to be blue Loctited. Blue Loctite through every single screw, crank them down as much as possible. JB weld your bushings in, all your typical generic sort of build goes on down in your lower. So with like your bearings and things, basically what we're doing is taking a little bit of grease and packing it into the gearbox like so, and repeat the process across all four. Just try not to get any grease down the thread of the screw hole there, just because once you put your Loctite in there it won't take as well when it's full of grease. You know, like I said, I am using a generous amount of grease on this, so you're basically like packing the bearing full of grease. So we are making sure that metal on metal is not creating a debilitating wear on the bearing or on the gearbox itself, and it'll just help prolong the life of your bearings and of your gearbox. So what we're doing now, basically install all your bearings. Just be aware that when you're using a MOSFET, make sure you screw it down as low as possible while retaining the space between the bushing hole, because the bearing may or may not foul depending on what bearing you're using, depending on what MOSFET you're using. So just be aware of that, as to make sure that it's not rubbing on your MOSFET at all. And same thing when you're installing your MOSFET, make sure it's not, you know, none of the back of the board is actually touching any part of the scythe. You don't want any sort of short circuits. With the piston track, you do want to grease it up. Obviously not too crazy, but you do want more than a normal amount of grease in your piston track, just to make sure that when it is cycling, it is ensuring that is not damaging the piston or the gearbox. You will notice that they all come pre-radiused, so everything is radiused at the back, at the front, because we have found these things can be pretty damn brutal on everything. So that's basically how your gearbox will sit there. And like I said, just be aware that your spring retainer does need to be braced in. So if you are using a buffer tube with a screw, make sure that that's in. Also a little bit of blue Loctite on that. It will tighten up with the vibration and things like that, so it shouldn't come undone. Right down to your MOSFET, like, I mean, you should be blue Loctiting that screw in anyway, but this is more so. You just have to realise that your MOSFET board has to be cranked down nice and tight. Obviously, don't damage your board as you're cranking down your screw. And yeah, just ensure that that little screw can't come out and get jammed in your sector and piston and things, because the vibration will eliminate anything. I'm talking right down to your fire selects, your mag release, even down to your sight. So the sight that you're running on your blaster, you do have to Loctite all of that too. Handguard screws, receiver screws, everything needs to be Loctited down in place, or else it will come apart. It will vibrate apart. These things are extremely brutal in terms of vibration. Also too, another thing we want to recommend is basically brushed motors over brushless for now, until pending further testing. What we have found is the ESCs cycling this bolt are struggling a little bit. It's not so much the motor itself, it's the ESC itself which is slightly struggling. They do run them, but we're looking for people to be able to get 40, 50, 60k shots out of their Taranis before any real sort of major servicing. So far, ESCs on motors at 28 RPS on these things are lasting anywhere between 7 and 10,000 shots. They are being stress tested, so it is an unusual amount of shots to be putting through it, versus say in a real life scenario like in a game. You're not doing 5,000 shots in the space of 2 hours. So, if you're one of those people that are interested in only semi or binary, I'm sure a warhead will be perfectly fine. But if you're going to be running full auto on these things, you do need to be aware that not just the vibration can vibrate things apart, but also the ESC is struggling to pump 5,000 shots in say 2 hours. So me personally, when I play, I average between 1,500 and 2,500 shots, mainly in either bursts and in binary, and even then it would be pushing it to its limit. So when I'm talking motors, I'm talking like ideal motors would be like a Destruction of God, 18k ASG Infinities, any high TPA armature. So don't just look for a motor that says high torque on it, because things like the SHS high torque motors are actually not that high torque. They're more of a speed and torque motor. You don't want anything speed in this. So at the moment we are using N52s, in specific the 15k 32 TPA N52. So we are combining them with 12-to-1s, so rate of fire through gearing, torque through motor, which is generally how I've always done things anyway. How we've always done things is speed through gearing and torque through motor. You can flip them around. Some people like to do high speed motors, torquier gears, that's fine. We've just always found better results through speed gears, torque motors. So that's another thing to be aware of, is specific motor choice. Another thing to be aware of is if you are running a brushed motor and you are running a battery, you may go through about 30% more battery use on these things, given that everything is a lot heavier. The motor current startup is a lot more, just due to the fact that it is pulling back something that's a lot heavier than your generic piston, which is why we don't recommend high rate of fire builds on the specific Taranis gearboxes. So on the Taranis, high rate of fire is at the moment not recommended. Keep it low rate of fire, 20 RPS and under, and you should have something that lasts you quite a long time. Apart from that, it is general servicing and general maintenancing. So, you do want to make sure that every now and again, after a few games, you do want to open it up, make sure everything's still greased, clean it down, re-grease it up, make sure that everything is running good. If you do have an anodized gearbox, make sure that you do take, like say, a little file, and just scuff up gently without affecting the actual diameter of the seating for the bushing. Just scuff it up so that when you do, say, epoxy your bushings in with either JB Weld or like a bearing retaining compound, that it does give it its maximum bond. Because if you just, say, JB Weld it and put your bushings in, the anodize can affect that and cause them to spin and not bond as strong. Given that if you are going for a low rate of fire build, that shouldn't be too much of an issue compared to your typical sort of 30 plus RPS, 40 plus RPS builds. And yeah, just make sure that you do bear in mind the voluming on these things are very different to a generic setup. Maximum voluming is about 70%. So yeah, just really sort of be careful with that. As you can see, your AOE is already done, so the next tooth is already cut on a 45-degree angle, just to allow for your piston coming back through. That's about it, guys. So yeah, bullet points are: make sure everything is Loctited down with blue Loctite, at minimum blue Loctite, and a lot of Loctite. Make sure it's cranked down. Grease all moving parts, all metal on metal moving parts need a PTFE grease. So just make sure you're using a nice grease on it. It can be so many different types of grease, whatever you prefer to use. It's completely up to you, just as long as it is PTFE. Just be aware that if grease does get in your piston slash cylinder, and it's not PTFE, it's a petroleum based, it can have a debilitating wear on your O-rings. So just make sure of that. In your cylinders, we recommend just your Aztech 1000 CST pure silicon oil. It is also known as an 80 weight shock oil for like RC cars. It's the same thing, but that's what we use, and that's what we have been using. So this stuff here, this is our 2000 CST. So the viscosity of this stuff is quite a bit thicker. This is more so for like pistols, things like that. So it's not ideal for seal of your O-rings and things. It can leave an inconsistent FPS with an inconsistent seal on your O-ring. So 1000 CST or an 80 weight pure silicon oil only, so no silicon sprays, things like that in here. WD-40 silicon spray is not going to work, nor will WD-40, so don't be putting that in here, and you should be safe apart from that. Everything else is your typical generic build. Got your motor, shim your pinion to bevel, bevel to spur, spur to sector, sector to piston. And install your MOSFET. Like I said, just be aware that some MOSFETs like the Leviathan may be a little close to that, so just double check that. I tend to pull the board down as far as it can possibly go, and it still maintains its line around the bushing, and it only just avoids that bearing there, so it is just enough. Apart from that, springs, like I said, springs are provided with the Taranis. So make sure that you do stick to that spring. If you do use a longer spring, it will unfortunately lock up your gearbox. And so if you're chasing higher FPS, things like that, I wouldn't be chasing higher FPS through adding different springs, unless you want to chop them down and run that risk yourself. Obviously that will void any form of warranty on this upper end. And basically from there, if you want to get higher FPS, just make sure that your barrel length isn't too long. Just try not to install too long a barrel, or else FPS does drop off, just because voluming becomes an issue on longer specific setups. So from there, basically, the piston does retract back and then come forward and seal in your bucking. Apart from that, guys, that's pretty much the Taranis. Looking forward to seeing how people go putting these things together, and how people go getting them out on the field. We have done quite a few now, so we are starting to see what they're capable of, how long they're lasting, what setups are ideal for it. But like I said, the recipe at the moment is 12s or 13s on, say, 15k or 18k ASG Infinity style motors with high TPA armatures, and obviously the higher C discharge battery you can use, the better. And the more milliamp hour batteries you can use, the better. They will function off your typical 11 volts as long as it is a good brand 3-cell battery, not your typical generic Chinese 2000 milliamps that are, you know, this big, that are really like 150, 250 milliamps. They will struggle on that particular setup. I would not recommend that. So yeah, apart from that, hope you guys doing well. Hope you guys get these things together, and look forward to seeing some beasts out on the field. Azrael's Armory.